Hey guys, so we are finally at that point of the season for Australian Survivor Brains vs. Brawn 2, and I'll be doing my jury scenarios video for this season. And obviously, this is kind of a weird spot in the season as we are now at the final 6, and I normally like to do it at the final 5. However, considering we are on this 2 episode a week schedule, and if I wait another week, there's a chance that we could be down to the final 4 by this point next week. And at that point, there aren't that many scenarios to get into. So I figured it's better to do it earlier rather than later to maximize the different possibilities to get into, and I think it's probably a better video because of that. So I decided to do it now, and I do think this is an interesting final 6, and I think there's definitely a lot that can happen between now and the end of the season. And if we're assuming that this is going to be a final 2, then there's still 4 rounds of gameplay left to get into, and obviously a lot can change between now and then, but I'll still do my best to forecast what would happen in each of these scenarios. Now at the time of recording, there are 6 people left in the game, those being AJ, Kalin, Kate, Morgan, Miles, and Zara. And right at the bat, we have to talk about Miles, who has been the frontrunner in my power rankings for a lot of the post-merge, and I do think Miles is the most likely winner of the season from an edit standpoint. And through that, I would expect a lot of the scenarios to have him in it to be higher in the list, particularly the ones that he ends up winning. Though at the same time, I think from a pure gameplay standpoint, I don't think Miles is necessarily the biggest jury threat, where I feel like a lot of the talk from people in the jury has been that AJ is the one in control of the game. And I feel like with Miles' association to AJ, that if the two of them were to get to the end together, that AJ would inherit more of the credit for the moves that the two of them were doing. And on top of that, you have certain jury members being annoyed by their actions, particularly with AJ and Miles coming off as pretty schemy and being prone to blow up other people's plans. And through that, they've annoyed the likes of Kalin and Kristen. And I feel like that'll definitely play a factor in a lot of the scenarios that involve them. But I still expect Miles to have at least some respect, and for him to bring up the Jungle Rat to Rat King story, I think that will definitely play a factor in a lot of scenarios where he gets to the end. And I think if he's there without AJ, I think Miles would still ultimately get a lot of credit for the moves that AJ and Miles are doing. So at the end of the day, I still think Miles is probably the most likely winner. Next up, we have AJ, and I do think AJ is probably the biggest jury threat of the season. I do think he is the one who people see as the big player, the person who has been in control for a lot of the season, and probably the person who's a bit more well-rounded in the game compared to Miles, to where AJ has all these other connections with the likes of Kate and Morgan. And I would expect AJ to still have a lot of respect from the jury if he gets to the end. Now, yes, there are people like Laura and Karen who are definitely annoyed by him and would definitely not be the happiest by voting for him, but I still think they at least recognize that AJ is the best player, and through that probably would vote for AJ at the end. So through that, I would expect AJ to win in a lot of scenarios where he gets to the end. Next up, we have Kalin, and I think Kalin's one of the more difficult players to assess when it comes to how he would do in a jury vote. Where I think on one hand, I think he has some serious perception issues where it seems like a lot of people don't take him that seriously and kind of see him as this doofus who doesn't really know what he's doing. Where you had Karen talking in her Jurability video about how Kalin had approached her with a Final 2, only for her to be shocked that he even knew what a Final 2 was. And I do think that's something that has permeated across Kalin for a lot of the season, even though he has plenty of pros going for him, like the fact that he has been the majority for a lot of the season, considering that he's also won a lot of immunities. I do think those things could definitely harm Kalin in a jury vote, that people don't really see the game for what he's playing. But on the other hand, I think Kalin has been doing a lot of this intentionally, and I do think there is at least some signs that he could shift this perception, where he obviously is a super fan of the game. He is someone who can definitely articulate his game well enough, and I do think if he gets to the end against anyone other than AJ or Miles, that he could explain his game well enough to where he could convert the likes of Laura or Polly to vote for him. So I do think Kalin is someone who could definitely go either way, depending on how the end game goes, but still someone who could win in certain scenarios. Next up, we have Kate and Morgan, and honestly, I'm not entirely sure where they stand individually in terms of their jury threats, where I feel like a lot of people have been talking about Kate and Morgan as a duo more so than them as individuals. However, if I had to put my money on it, I would assume Morgan is inherently the bigger jury threat. She seems like someone that it would inherently have more respect from a jury compared to Kate, though I think a lot of that is also due to speculation. But on the other hand, I think it's also pretty unlikely that they get to the end anyway, but it still made forecasting their scenarios pretty difficult. Finally, we have Zara, and as I've alluded to in my previous power rankings, I think Zara is the smallest jury threat. I think she is probably the most likely to be a losing finalist, And I would expect a lot of the scenarios to have her in it to be a bit more likely, though in a spot to where she doesn't win, as I feel like people don't really respect Zara that much, archetype wise. Also, based on the game that she's played, where while you have Kalin as a close ally for her, you also have people like Kristen, who was annoyed by Zara for not flipping the game on AJ when she approached her with his plan. And I think Zara will have a lot of difficulty separating herself from AJ and Miles, considering she has been working with the graduate side more recently. So in general, I'm not looking at Zara as that big of a jury threat, and it wouldn't shock me if she got to the end in a losing position. And moving over to the jury, we currently have 5 people in the jury, those being Laura, Polly, Karen, Logan, and Kristen. And obviously a lot of the talk online has been about how this jury in particular has been a very emotional one. Though at the same time, I think a lot of that anger is directed towards other people on the jury, where I feel like Polly is more upset at people like Laura and Kristen than anyone else. And at the same time, you've also had people like Karen and Logan being pretty annoyed at the likes of AJ and Miles during a lot of it. And through that, it makes me wonder how bitter they'll actually be. However, if I'm being honest, I don't think they'll be that bitter by the time of the actual vote, or I think there'll definitely be people voting based on who they think is the best player. I think people like Laura and Karen will definitely come around to recognizing that someone like AJ is playing the best game, for instance. So I don't think a lot of these jurors are people who are going to be necessarily voting against who they see as the best player. I think they will come around for the most part to voting for either AJ or Miles. Now within that, I think probably Logan or Kristen are probably the least likely to vote for AJ and Miles, where I feel like the likes of them will be more likely to vote for Morgan and Kate, for instance. But I would still expect a lot of this jury to ultimately side towards the people who I've described as being the bigger jury. That's people like AJ, Miles, Kalin, people who I think they think are seen as the biggest players of the season. And through that, I would expect them to vote accordingly. So with that context, I will now be ranking all the final 2 scenarios based on how likely I think are to happen and forecasting what I think would happen if those final 2s were to happen. Now, admittedly, there still is some uncertainty over whether the season will end with a final 2 or a final 3, and we've seen in recent seasons that Australian Survivor has been willing to go back and forth between a final 2 and a final 3. But to keep things simple, I will be discussing final 2 scenarios, as I feel like a lot of the final 3 scenarios would play out pretty similarly to the final 2 scenario versions. And I think on top of that, I think I would expect it to be a final 2 if I had to pick one. Both out of the way, we have 15 final 2 scenarios to break down, and let's waste more time. Let's get into the video. So starting off at number 15, the final 2 scenario that I believe is the least likely to happen is one that I've already alluded to earlier on, and that is Kate versus Morgan. And I feel like these two are on the bottom because I feel like these are the 2 least likely people to actually get to the end, where you have Morgan, someone who has been pretty much invisible in the edit for a lot of the post-merge, and Kate, someone who has been getting a bit more focus, but clearly not a rooting interest here. I feel like these 2 are the least likely to go on to win the season from an edit perspective. And I think with all the talk about how they're this duo that needs to be broken up, I find it very unlikely that they'll actually get to the end together. And through that, I do think this is the least likely scenario to play out. However, if it were to happen, I actually don't know what would happen if I'm being truly honest, as I don't really know what the perception is about Kate and Morgan individually. I feel like we've only ever heard about them being talked about as a duo. Though, if for the sake of this video, I will be assuming Morgan is the favorite here, and for the purposes of this video, I did decide to make it a unanimous Morgan vote. Now, do I think this is actually what would happen? Probably not. I think Kate could definitely get some votes here from like AJ or Karen, for instance. I don't think it would be this unanimous decision. And I feel like it's largely based off me not having more information about how the people in the game view the 2 of them individually. But at the same time, I don't think it really matters, as I don't think they're getting to the end together. I think one of them will definitely be cut at some point from an edit standpoint, and even from a game standpoint. I think there's definitely going to be this push to take Kate and Morgan out. So while I do have Morgan winning this scenario, I don't think this will happen anyway, and through that, none of this is relevant. So because of that, I do have it here at number 15. Now moving on to number 14, and we have another scenario involving the person I don't think is winning, and that is Morgan versus Zara. Now, as a disclaimer here, I did decide to have all the Morgan scenarios at the very bottom, as I think Morgan is the least likely person to get to the very end, as I feel like if she were the winner, she would not be presented this way, as we would want to know why she goes on to win. And even if she were the losing finalist in whatever scenario she was in, I still think she would be getting a bigger edit to explain why she goes on to lose this season. But I feel like with her being pretty invisible, I just don't think any of the scenarios involving her are likely to happen anyway. And I feel like with this one, again, it's largely arbitrary. I'm pretty much going in the order of the power ranking here. And again, I do think there is at least a path here if Morgan were to win out and drag Zara to as a GOAT. I think there's definitely a path there. But at the same time, I don't think it's very likely. Though if this scenario were to happen, I would expect Morgan to be the clear favorite here. Now, I do think Zara could get some votes. I think Karin could give her a sympathy vote. I think Kalin's also someone who seemed to have a fine enough relationship with Zara, and I could definitely see a world where Kalin throws a vote into Zara there. But I do think the rest of the votes would clearly land on Morgan here. Not too surprising, but still, this scenario is definitely not happening, which is why it's here at number 14. Now, moving on to number 13, and we are just continuing with these Morgan scenarios, and here we have AJ versus Morgan. Now, you could definitely debate this one being a bit higher, as AJ is obviously aligned with Morgan, and through that, you could definitely see a world where AJ cuts the likes of Kalin and Miles and decides to go in on taking Morgan. Though at the same time, I don't think AJ would actually take that route regardless, as I would assume he would see Morgan as a somewhat big jury threat. And through that, I think AJ would definitely try to cut Morgan first if he had the chance. I think AJ would want to take Kate deeper into the game compared to Morgan. So through that, I don't think this scenario is very likely either. Now, if the scenario were to happen, I would expect AJ to actually be the favorite here, as I think he would definitely get a lot of votes here. Now, I do think Morgan would still get a few votes. I think she would get Kate's vote, obviously, as they're a duo. And I do think Logan and Kristen also vote Morgan, probably, as I alluded to earlier. I think Logan and Kristen are two of the less likely people to vote for AJ and Miles in general. And I think they would definitely be looking for a viable alternative to not vote for AJ. And I think Morgan kind of fits that bill, especially with the likes of Logan and Kristen talking about how they want a woman to win. I think that would definitely incentivize them to vote for Morgan in this spot. So through that, I do think it'd be somewhat competitive, even though AJ would win. But again, I don't think Morgan's even getting to the end. And through that, none of this matters. Because of that, it's here number 13. Now moving on to number 12, and we have another scenario that has Morgan in it. And here we have Kalin versus Morgan. And again, we're just continuing down the line here of these scenarios that are less likely to happen. And I do think Kalin could take Morgan if he recognizes that he needs to cut AJ and Miles and really make him be the sole person to take credit for the Graduates Alliance. I do think there's a path there, but I still think the fact that Morgan is in it makes it less likely to happen. Now, if it were to happen, I actually think it would be somewhat close here, where I do think both of them would get a decent amount of votes here, where the likes of Morgan would get the likes of Kate, Logan, and Kristen, as obviously this anti-AJ Miles sentiment. I actually think Karin would probably also vote for Morgan in the spot, as I would assume Karin would be less likely to recognize Kalin's game, even if we were to articulate it. And third, I do think Karin would be less likely to vote for Kalin in a lot of scenarios compared to her willingness to vote for AJ and Miles. Now, I do think Kalin still would definitely get some votes here with the likes of Laura, Polly, AJ, Miles, and Zara there. And I do think it would be a relatively close vote, where I do have Kalin squeaking out the win, but it would still be a pretty close vote regardless. But again, I don't think this scenario is particularly likely to happen either, which is why it's here at number 12. Now moving on to number 11, and we're literally wrapping up all the scenarios that have Morgan in it, and here we have Morgan versus Miles. And really this one is only this high because it at least has Miles in it, who I do think is winning the season. And through that, I do think that makes it a bit more likely to happen here. And you can definitely argue that with Miles cutting the likes of AJ and Kalin along the way, that it would allow him to claim sole credit for the work that AJ had done throughout the game. So through that, I do think Miles is somewhat more likely to take Morgan compared to the others. Now, if this scenario were to happen, I do expect it to also be a bit more competitive, where the likes of Logan, Kristen, and Kate would vote for Morgan. But I do think Miles would have an easier time winning this scenario, where he would have the likes of Laura and Polly voting for him. AJ, along with Kalin, would also vote for him. Zara would vote for him. I do think Karin's a bit more on the fence here, but I do think she would lean towards Miles in the scenario. So I do think Miles would still win here, sort of similar to what he would do against AJ and Morgan. But again, I feel like Morgan is at least a person to get to the end, and through that, this scenario is less likely to happen. So because of that, I do have it here number 11. Now moving on to number 10, and I feel like this scenario is largely this low due to the edit side of things. But number 10, we do have Kate versus Zara. And I think this scenario definitely has a path of happening, where I can see a world where Kate ends up winning out from this point and is able to go on this run and eventually drag Zara to the end as her easiest beat. Though I think from an edit standpoint, I don't think this one's as likely to happen, as I think we're meant to be looking way more at the likes of AJ and Miles. Even Kalin, I think, has more of a shot of winning from an edit standpoint. So I think the fact that Kate is the one that goes on this big run is a bit far-fetched based off the stuff we've been seeing and the way it's been presented. Though I think if this scenario were to happen, I do think Kate would clearly win this scenario, where while Zara could get some sympathy votes from the likes of Kalin or Kalin, I do think Kate would definitely run away with the scenario and win the season. Though I think that also is why I don't think it's as likely to happen, as I don't think Kate is winning the season from an edit standpoint. So while there's definitely a path for this scenario to happen from a gameplay standpoint, I think edit wise, it's just not in the cards, which is why it's here at number 10. Now moving on to number 9, and we have another scenario that on paper doesn't seem that far fetched, but I don't think is as likely to happen considering the story of the season, and here we have Kalin versus Kate. And I think this one definitely has a path to happening as well, though I think something holding it back is the fact that I do think Kalin would try to take Zara to the end over Kate, and I do think if this scenario were to happen, it would be more so due to Kate winning out and having to choose between like Kalin or AJ, or example. So I do think that makes it a bit less likely to happen. Though again, I feel like there's at least a path for Kalin to go on to win in this season. Though I do think if this scenario were to happen, it would definitely be an interesting jury vote to say the least, where I do think it would be well contested between the two, where I think Kate would have some locked votes in the likes of Karen, Kristen, and Morgan. I do think Kalin would have some votes in the likes of AJ, Miles, Zara, even Laura and Polly, I think, would side with Kalin over Kate. And I do think at that point the game would come down to Logan and what she decides to do. I'm not entirely sure where she would lean, if I'm being perfectly honest, as I think she's someone who's definitely down on Kalin at this current point, but could definitely turn around on him later on. So I do think that makes it a bit more interesting what would happen, but at the end of the day, I still think this scenario is not the most likely to happen, which is why it's here at number 9. Now moving on to number 8, and we have another scenario that I think is not super likely to happen, largely because of the edit. And here we have probably the biggest matchup on the board, and that is AJ versus Miles. And obviously, these two have been working together for a lot of the post merge here. However, I don't think they'll actually want to go to the end together, as I think they would both see each other as a reasonably big threat and try to take the other out before the end. And I do also think that with the edit pointing towards a Miles win, that taking out AJ would be this ultimate accomplishment for Miles to take on if he were to go on to win the season. And then it also carries over to what I think would happen, where I do think AJ beats Miles here pretty handily, if I'm being perfectly honest, as I do think a lot of the jury sees AJ as the bigger player. And I think despite Miles having this underdog run, despite him having played all these idols, I do think Miles is still a bit too attached to AJ to where I think it would be hard for Miles to truly separate himself from AJ. I think their perceptions are pretty similar. And I do think AJ would be seen as a better version of Miles in a lot of ways. And through that, the likes of Laura and Kalin would want to prefer AJ to win over Miles. So I do think to that end, AJ would win pretty handily here. And considering that I think Miles is set up to win the season from an edit standpoint, I think that's what makes it less likely, as I think AJ is the one who will come up short by the end of it. And while I could be wrong about AJ, and AJ could end up being the winner instead, I think based off my current read of the edit, I do think AJ is being primed to lose. And through that, I do think this scenario where AJ beats Miles is a bit less likely, to where I have it here at number 8. Now moving on to number 7, and we have another somewhat similar scenario, and here we have AJ versus Kate. Now, I do think there is a world where AJ could drag Kate to the end, particularly the likes of Zara sniped out of the game at some point, where I think AJ would definitely try to weaken Kate and Morgan by taking out Morgan, and through that want to go to the end with Kate. But even so, I do think AJ would still at least try to get the end with Zara instead. And on top of that, this scenario would definitely lead to an AJ win, which makes it less likely as well. And as I alluded to, I think if this scenario were to happen, I think AJ would clearly win. Now, mind you, I think Kate would definitely get some votes here, where I think the likes of Morgan would vote for her. Also, Logan and Kristen, I think, probably pulled the trigger in voting for Kate in this scenario. So, again, it wouldn't be a landslide or anything, but I still think AJ would be the definitive winner by the end of it. But still, I don't think the scenario is the most likely, which is why it's here at number 7. Now moving on to number 6, and this is another scenario that I do think has a path towards happening, but I just think other scenarios are more likely, if I'm being honest. But number 6, we do have Kate versus Miles. And admittedly, I don't think the scenario is inherently unlikely to happen, where I could at least see a world where Kate is like this losing finalist. Though to be fair, I think other people are being set up to have losing finalist edits compared to Kate. I think Kate, while definitely could come off as that way to certain people, I don't think she's being set up for that spot. I think Kate is just more likely to be cut before the end. And I do think if the scenario were to happen, I do think Miles would win here. Mind you, I think it would still be competitive, where I think Logan, Kristen, and Morgan vote for Kate here. Karen could definitely be on the fence in this scenario, if I'm being honest, where I could definitely see her voting for Kate over Miles. But even so, I still would expect Miles to be the favorite here. So not the most crazy scenario in the world where it still leads to a Miles win. And you could definitely make the argument that Kate is being edited to be this losing finalist, but still, I don't think it's the most likely scenario to happen, which is why I do have it here at number 6. Now moving on to number 5, and I'm actually surprised this scenario is as high as it is. However, I do think it will at least lead to some intrigue. By number 5, we do have AJ versus Kalin. Now, I do think if AJ were to go on to win the season, if he is truly the winner of the season, I think this is definitely one of the more likely paths he takes here, where he ends up taking the likes of Kalin to the end, or alternatively, Kalin ends up going on this big immunity run, winning out from the final 6, and then decides to take AJ to the end, thinking that he could somehow beat AJ at the end, or it could be in a spot to where Miles is in the final 3 and Kalin thinks that Miles is the bigger jury threat, which leads to him taking AJ, only for AJ to win by the end of it. Where I think if the scenario were to happen, I do think AJ would be the favorite here. Now again, I still think it would be competitive, where I think Logan, Kristen would be open to voting for Kalin over AJ. Even Zara, someone I could definitely see voting for Kalin over AJ, as it seems like they have a pretty good relationship. And I do think Laura could be on the fence in this scenario, particularly if Kalen's able to articulate his game pretty well. But I still think AJ would be the favorite here. I think he would definitely have a lot of the other votes locked up to where he would win by the end of it. So I do think if AJ were to go on to win the season, this would probably be the more likely scenario to happen. Not the most likely, but definitely one of the more likely ones. But I still think with AJ being less likely to win than Miles, I do have to leave it behind here at number 5. Now moving on to number 4, and we actually have the highest ranked scenario that has AJ in it, and here I have AJ versus Zara. And I do think AJ probably would take Zara to the end over Kalin if he had the choice, as I think he would see Zara as his easiest beat. And considering that Zara is being set up to be this losing finalist, I think it would definitely make a lot of sense there. And I think if the scenario were to happen, I think AJ would easily beat Zara here. And while there could be some sympathy votes with the likes of Kristen and Karin, even Logan, I think could be on the fence here. I do think AJ would have definitely an easier time winning against Zara compared to Kalin. And I think if AJ is truly the winner, that I think this is the most likely path for him to take. But at the same time, I do think the fact that AJ is someone that I'm not as confident to actually win the season by the end of it, I did decide to leave him behind here at number 4. Now moving on to number 3, and this is definitely the scenario that I would imagine if Kalin were to win the season. And number 3, we do have Kalin versus Zara. And again, I think if Kalin is his dark horse that goes on to win the season, that I think this is probably the path he would take, where he would recognize that both AJ and Miles are his biggest threat, and through that he probably would cut them along the way until we get to this final 2 here. And I think in the scenario, I think Kalin would win near unanimously. Now I think Karin probably throws a sympathy vote onto Zara considering their relationship throughout the game, but I do think Kalin would have a pretty easy time convincing the jury that he should win over Zara of all people. So through that, I do think Kalin would be a pretty likely winner in this case. And I do think if Kalin were to win the season, that this would be probably the most likely path that we would take here. But at the same time, I don't think this is the most likely scenario to happen in the world, which is why I do have it here at number 3. Now moving on to number 2, and as a spoiler for the rest of the list, these top 2 both have Miles in it, and both of them technically result in a Miles win, though I think the path there is quite a bit different for each of them. But number 2, I did decide to go with Kalin versus Miles, and I think this one has a somewhat straightforward path where, assuming that AJ, Miles, and Kalin are this final 3 through their connections with the Majority Alliance, I could definitely see that path playing out here, and I could definitely see a final 3 where if Kalin were to win final immunity, that he would take his chances against Miles due to AJ being the bigger threat, and vice versa. If Miles were to win final immunity, that he would want to take his chances against Kalin than anyone else. So I can definitely see this final 2 playing out in that regard. And I actually think if it were to happen, it would be a bloodbath. I think this could actually be a very close jury vote, where I think both Kalin and Miles would have votes here, where I think Kalin would probably get the votes of Polly in this scenario, and I think also Logan in this scenario as well. Kristen, I think, is probably also a Kalin vote, as well as Zara. Well, I think Miles would have the votes of AJ, and through that, Kate and Morgan. I think he probably gets Karin's vote in this scenario, which I think is pretty good there. And at that point, the game essentially comes down to Laura. I think Laura would be the swing vote here, where she could either vote for Kalin or for Miles to give either of them the win. And if we are going off the edit of the season, I think she probably would lean towards Miles, I guess. Though I could also see her voting for Kalin as well. So I do think this is actually a very close jury vote here. And considering that I could see both of them being the winner of the season, I think it would make sense there. Though, if Kalin were to be the losing finalist in this scenario, I think that's also a viable path considering his edit. I do think Kalin has his edit where he could either be a winner or a losing finalist, and I think this scenario would allow both of those to play out. But I still think this is not the most likely scenario to play out, which is why I do have to leave it behind here at number 2. And now, at number 1, the final 2 scenario that I believe is the most likely to happen is Miles versus Zara. And I think this one is the most straightforward. You have Miles, who I think is the most likely winner of the season from an edit standpoint. You have Zara, who I think is the most likely losing finalist from this scenario. And I think from a gameplay standpoint, it makes sense why the two of them would get towards the end and why they would want to take each other to the end over the likes of AJ or Kalin, for instance. So I think it makes a lot of sense in that regard. And I do think in this scenario, Miles would have a much easier time winning where he would get the majority of the votes. And while Zara could get some votes here from Kristen, Karin, and Logan, I think Miles would have a lot more locked votes in this scenario compared to Kalin versus Miles. And I think based off both of their edits, I think this scenario is somewhat likely. I think gameplay wise, there's definitely a path for both of them to get to the end here where I think Miles has a pretty smooth ride for the next few rounds. I think Zara is someone who's not really seen as a target at this point. So through that, I think the scenario is probably the most likely to happen, and because of that, it is here at number 1. And there we go, that'll do it for this week's video. If you liked this content, be sure to like and subscribe, it helps out with the channel. Now, after the season ends, I plan to do my usual player ranking and review for the season, so be on the lookout for that. And I'm covering The Amazing Race and Survivor 48 as well, so be on the lookout for videos on those shows. I'm on Patreon and a YouTube membership, so if you want to consider supporting the channel, you can do so by clicking the link in the description. And you can also join the Discord server by also clicking the link in the description. There's a lot of stuff coming your way, but for now, that is the video. See ya.